It was a bright, quiet morning when Henry, a 90-year-old war veteran, decided to take his usual walk to his favorite cafe. He had lived in the small town for many years and had grown used to the peaceful routine that filled his days. He wore his old, well-worn coat, and his shoes, though simple, carried the weight of decades. His hand shook slightly as he gripped his cane, but his steps were steady and his heart was at ease. He didn't need much these days. A cup of coffee and a simple sandwich were enough to start his day. Henry had served in the war many years ago, and though the world had changed around him, he still carried the memories of those days in his mind. He didn't talk about it much, but the stories were there, buried beneath the surface. Most people who knew him saw only a kindly old man with a slow gait and a gentle smile. They didn't know about the young soldier who had fought on distant lands, braving dangers no one should ever face. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered to Henry now was the peace he had found in his quiet life. The cafe wasn't far from his house. He had been coming to this same spot for years, long before the newer, younger faces filled the tables. There was something about the place that brought him comfort. Perhaps it was the smell of fresh bread in the air, or the quiet murmur of people enjoying their morning coffee. Or maybe it was the familiar faces behind the counter, each one greeting him with a smile, as they had done for so long. It was a place where he felt welcomed, and where he could spend a few moments in the company of others. When Henry stepped into the cafe that morning, he noticed a few people sitting at their tables, chatting softly. The place wasn't crowded, but the staff seemed busy. He made his way to the counter, leaning slightly on his cane as he reached the counter. "Good morning, Henry," greeted Carla, the young woman who usually worked behind the register. She flashed him a warm smile, but her eyes were focused on something else, her attention divided. "Good morning, Carla," Henry replied, his voice soft but steady. "Just the usual, a sandwich and a cup of coffee." Carla nodded without really looking up. "Sure thing," she said distractedly. Henry didn't mind. He was used to it by now. In a world where everything seemed to rush by, he was content to take things slowly, savoring every moment, even the small, simple ones. But today was different. As Henry waited for his order, he could feel the eyes of a few customers on him. They weren't staring, but their glances lingered longer than usual. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the sound of the coffee machine whirring and the soft clink of plates being set down on tables. Then he heard a young man, sitting at a table nearby, snicker. "What's he doing here? Probably just wants a free meal," the man muttered loudly enough for Henry to hear. Henry paused, feeling the sting of the words. He tried to brush it off, but the moment stayed with him. He had been a soldier, a man who had served his country, and yet here he was, being judged over something as simple as a sandwich. The young man's words echoed in his mind as he stood there, waiting for his meal, wondering if this was what the world had become, quick to judge and slow to offer kindness. He had been through so much in his life, yet nothing had prepared him for this kind of moment, and as the seconds passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something he wasn't quite ready for. Henry's fingers tightened around the handle of his cane, a small act of control in a moment where he felt a little helpless. The muttered words from the young man still echoed in his mind, but he tried to ignore them. He had been through far worse in his life, and one cruel comment wouldn't shake him. Yet, as he stood there waiting, something in the air felt different. The warmth of the cafe, which usually gave him comfort, now seemed colder. Carla, the young woman behind the counter, continued to prepare drinks, her attention split between the orders. She had always been kind to Henry, but there was something in the way she avoided his gaze today that made him uneasy. She seemed distracted, almost like she didn't want to be bothered by the old man who had come in for his usual order. He could feel the distance in her movements, as though the conversation they had shared for years was suddenly unwelcome. The sound of the espresso machine hummed in the background, the comforting smell of fresh coffee filling the air. But Henry couldn't enjoy it the way he usually did. Instead, he found himself fidgeting, unsure of how to handle the situation. Should he say something? Should he just walk out and forget it ever happened? But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the uncomfortable feeling in his chest wouldn't go away. Henry shifted his weight, feeling the pressure on his legs, and glanced around the cafe. The other customers were either too busy with their own conversations or buried in their phones to notice him, except for one man who sat at a small table near the window. He had been watching Henry from the moment he walked in, his gaze not a simple glance, but a stare that made Henry uneasy. The man's eyes flicked over to Henry, then back down to his cup, and then back again. "You're still here," the young man muttered louder this time, just enough for Henry to hear. His voice was sarcastic, and Henry could feel his eyes boring into him. Carla looked up at the young man, but before she could say anything, he snickered again, shaking his head. "Guess he doesn't have anywhere better to be, huh?" The words stung more than Henry expected. They felt like a slap, like something more than just an insult. Henry's old mind tried to focus on his breathing, tried to push the hurt away, but it wasn't easy. He didn't want to be the old man who just took things lying down, but at that moment, he wasn't sure what to do. Carla finished making the coffee, glancing nervously at the man by the window. She handed the cup over to a waiting customer, but didn't look back at Henry. Her eyes lingered on the young man, and for the first time, Henry noticed a hint of discomfort in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him wonder if she knew just how wrong everything felt in that moment. The room seemed to grow quieter, the tension building in the space between him and the other customers. But just as the silence began to feel unbearable, a voice broke through. "Is everything okay here?" A gentle voice asked from across the room. It was an older woman, someone Henry had seen before, though he didn't know her name. She had been sitting alone at a table, sipping her coffee, but now she stood, her eyes meeting Henry's with a look of understanding. Henry didn't know what to say. He didn't want to cause trouble or make a scene, but there was something in the woman's tone that gave him hope that not everyone in the world had forgotten how to show kindness. The young man by the window rolled his eyes, but the woman didn't back down. She stood her ground, her eyes sharp as she watched the situation unfold. And for the first time since Henry walked into the cafe, he felt like someone might actually have his back. Henry could feel his heart racing a little faster. The tension in the air was thick, and for a brief moment, he considered leaving. Maybe it wasn't worth it. But before he could take a step, the older woman who had spoken up earlier made her way over to the young man by the window. He hadn't noticed her approach, too busy looking at his phone, but as she got closer, her presence was undeniable. "Excuse me," the woman said firmly, her voice loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. She didn't raise it in anger, but there was strength behind it. "What you just said about that man," she continued, her eyes locking with the young man's. "It wasn't funny, and it wasn't kind. I'm sure he's not bothering you. So why don't you keep your comments to yourself?" The young man froze, his phone still in his hands but now forgotten. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, his face turning red with embarrassment. The other customers in the cafe, who had been ignoring the exchange up until now, looked up at the scene. Some of them seemed uncomfortable, while others glanced at the young man, waiting to see how he would react. Henry, who had been standing there quietly, unsure of what to do, felt a strange sense of relief. He didn't want to make a scene, but it felt good to know someone cared enough to stand up for him. Still, the embarrassment of the moment lingered. The young man was now glaring at the woman, clearly annoyed, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, too quiet for Henry to hear. The older woman, undeterred, turned to Henry. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked gently. Her tone was soft, and her eyes were filled with genuine concern. Henry felt a rush of warmth. She didn't know him, but her kindness was like a balm to the hurt he'd been feeling. For a moment, he simply nodded, unsure how to respond. "I'm fine, just a bit taken aback," Henry said with a small smile, trying to brush it off. He didn't want to make it seem like he couldn't handle a little teasing. After all, he had been through a lot worse in his life. But as he spoke, he realized that the woman had done more for him in those few moments than anyone else in the cafe had. The young man, still glaring, finally stood up, muttering something about not needing to take this. He walked quickly toward the door, not looking back. The cafe fell silent for a few seconds before the atmosphere shifted. The woman, still standing, smiled at Henry before turning back to her seat. The people around them slowly returned to their conversations, but the change in the room was noticeable. The tension had lifted, and something about the moment felt different now. Henry sat back down at his usual table, feeling a little more at peace. He wasn't sure why he'd been treated that way in the first place. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just an old man, quietly waiting for his meal. But in that instant, something had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. The cafe staff, who had been silent throughout the whole exchange, now seemed more attentive. Carla, who had been behind the counter, gave Henry a small apologetic look before quickly returning to her work. Henry nodded, accepting the unspoken apology. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in that moment, Henry felt a little less alone, a little less forgotten. It wasn't much, but sometimes, just a small act of kindness was enough to change the course of a day. As Henry sat back down at his table, his mind began to wander. The tension from the earlier moment started to fade, but it left him with a sense of reflection. His hands rested on the table, and he stared down at the wrinkles in his skin, the years clearly visible in every line. He wasn't bothered by it. Those lines told the story of a life well lived, a life full of experiences, struggles, and triumphs. But as he sat there, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed over the years. Henry had been a soldier once, a young man, eager and proud, who had answered his country's call. Back then, he had never imagined that someday he would be sitting in a cafe, his hands shaking from age, treated as though he was invisible to the world around him. The memories of his service in the war felt distant now, but they were still vivid in his mind. He had been on the front lines, fighting alongside men from all walks of life. He had witnessed moments of fear, bravery, and loss, experiences that shaped who he had become. He remembered the early days when he first enlisted. He was just a boy, still full of hope and dreams, not fully understanding the weight of what he was about to face. But as soon as he stepped onto the battlefield, those dreams were replaced by the harsh reality of war. The sounds of gunfire, the constant tension, the friendships forged in the face of danger, all of it had become part of him. He had learned quickly that in war, it was survival that mattered most. And survival required sacrifice, discipline, and strength. Henry had seen his share of battles, each one leaving its mark on him. There were times when he wondered if he would ever make it out alive. There were moments of quiet when he and his fellow soldiers would sit together, talking about home, about their families, about the lives they hoped to return to. But not everyone was lucky enough to make it home. He had lost many friends, some of whom he had known for only a short time, but whose memories would stay with him forever. They were the ones who would never get to sit in a cafe like this, to enjoy the small pleasures of life. Henry owed them his life, and he carried their memory with him every day. But now, as an old man, those memories were all he had left. He wasn't the young soldier who had once been filled with pride and ambition. He was someone different now, a man who had lived through much, seen more than he cared to, and who now found himself in a world that seemed to move faster than he could keep up with. It wasn't just the cafe that had changed. The whole world had shifted. People no longer seemed to have time for the past, for the sacrifices that had been made. They were too busy, too distracted, too quick to judge. Henry had learned to accept that, but it didn't make it any easier. The world had become a place where people didn't always appreciate the value of a life lived through hardship, and yet here he was, still holding on, still standing tall in the face of everything life had thrown at him. Even if the world had forgotten him for a moment, he hadn't forgotten the lessons he had learned, the honor he had served with, and the pride he still held deep within his heart. As he sat there, nursing his coffee, Henry felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world might have changed, but he hadn't, and that, he thought, was enough. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by the soft clinking of dishes, and he glanced around the cafe once more. The moment of tension had passed, but the feeling of discomfort still lingered in the air. The young man who had made the hurtful comment was gone now, leaving a silence that filled the room. People continued with their morning routines, ordering coffee, chatting softly, and going about their business. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't quite belong in this world anymore. His eyes drifted to the window, where the sun was shining brightly. It was a beautiful day, yet somehow it didn't feel as warm as it should. Maybe it was the sting of the words earlier. Maybe it was just the weight of his age. Or maybe it was the realization that the world had changed so much that it was hard for him to find his place in it. Sipping his coffee, Henry's mind wandered back to the days when he was young, full of energy and ambition. Back then, life had felt full of possibilities. He had dreams of making a difference in the world, of being part of something greater than himself. He had enlisted to fight for those dreams, to defend the country he loved and the people he cared about. It hadn't been an easy journey, but he had given everything he had, knowing that he was part of something bigger than himself. But now, it seemed like those dreams had faded. The world had moved on. People no longer seemed to care about the sacrifices that had been made, the hard work that had gone into building the life they enjoyed today. Young people no longer seemed to understand the value of respect, of kindness, of honor. It was as though those things had become old-fashioned, forgotten in the rush of modern life. Henry couldn't help but wonder if he had become a relic of the past, a man who had seen too much, done too much, and now found himself in a world that didn't need him anymore. He wasn't sure if that thought made him feel sad or relieved. Maybe a little bit of both. He glanced down at his hands, rough and weathered from years of hard work. They trembled slightly, not from fear or weakness, but from the weight of time. He had lived a long life, and there were days when the memories of his youth seemed like they belonged to someone else. Those days when he had been strong and capable, when he had believed in the future, now seemed distant and unreachable. But even as those thoughts filled his mind, something else began to surface. The small act of kindness from the woman who had stood up for him earlier began to play in his mind. She had seen something in him, something that the others hadn't. She had cared enough to speak up, to remind the young man of the value of respect. And in doing so, she had reminded Henry of something he hadn't thought about in a long time, the simple truth that there was still kindness in the world. He smiled softly to himself. Maybe the world wasn't as lost as he thought. Maybe there were still people who remembered the things that mattered. As the woman had shown him, it was possible to make a difference, even in small ways. And perhaps that was all that mattered now, small acts of kindness, respect, and honor. Henry finished his coffee, feeling a little lighter than he had before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that he still had a place in this world. Maybe not in the same way he once had, but he was still here, still standing. And that, he thought, was worth something. The cafe had settled back into its usual rhythm, the hum of conversation and clinking of cups filling the air. Henry felt a slight calm return to the space. The young man who had made the rude comment was gone, and the tension seemed to have melted away. The staff, including Carla, now seemed a little more attentive, their usual routine restored. Yet, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had left an impression on him, a reminder of how quickly things could change, how small moments could become bigger than they seemed. As he sat there quietly, sipping his coffee, a woman at a nearby table caught his attention. She had been sitting alone when the unpleasant exchange took place, her eyes flicking between the young man and the cafe staff. Now, as Henry settled into the calm, she stood up, walked confidently across the room, and made her way toward the counter. Henry watched her from his table, wondering what she was going to do. The woman had a presence about her, calm but assertive. She didn't look angry or upset. Instead, she seemed determined, like she was about to set something right. Henry wasn't sure if he should expect her to speak up or simply leave it behind, but her actions had already captured his attention. When she reached the counter, Carla looked up, a little surprised to see her approaching. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. She simply spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Her eyes turned toward Henry, who was sitting at his table, still processing the earlier events. No one should be treated like that, especially not someone who spent their life giving to the world. "I wanted to make sure you weren't feeling uncomfortable." Carla blinked a few times, clearly caught off guard by the woman's words. The other staff members behind the counter glanced over, but no one spoke. Carla, shifting her weight, finally offered a weak smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't think. I mean, it's just been a busy morning." The woman raised an eyebrow, not letting the excuse slide. "It's not just about being busy. It's about respect. Everyone deserves it, no matter how old they are or where they come from. And when someone is treated poorly, it's important that we stand up for them." Henry, still sitting in his chair, watched the exchange unfold. He wasn't sure what to expect. The situation could have turned into something more uncomfortable, but instead, the woman's words had a soothing effect. Carla, though a bit nervous, didn't argue. There was no hostility in the woman's tone, just a quiet but firm reminder of how important respect was. "I apologize for what happened," Carla said, her voice quieter now, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It won't happen again." The woman gave a small nod, then turned to Henry. She smiled gently, her eyes filled with kindness. "Are you doing all right, sir?" she asked, making sure Henry felt heard. Henry was taken aback. He had been expecting the world to move on, to ignore what had happened. But here was this stranger, taking the time to stand up for him, to make sure he knew he wasn't forgotten. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had grown used to being invisible, but this small act of kindness was a reminder that there were still people who saw him, who cared. "I'm fine," Henry said softly, giving her a warm smile. "It's just been a bit of a rough day, that's all. But thank you, really." The woman smiled back at him and nodded before returning to her seat. As she walked away, Henry felt a quiet sense of gratitude. She hadn't changed the whole world, but she had made a difference in his small corner of it. For the first time today, Henry felt like someone had truly understood him. It was a simple act, but in a world where kindness often felt scarce, it was enough to remind him that not all was lost. The quiet hum of the cafe filled the air as Henry sat back, feeling a little more at ease. The young man who had mocked him was long gone, and the older woman's kind words still echoed in his mind. It was a small thing, a simple conversation, but it had made him feel like someone cared again. The day had started with a sting, but now it seemed like things were looking up. As Henry continued to sit, sipping his coffee, he noticed the cafe manager walking towards him. It was Carl, a man who had worked at the cafe for years, ever since Henry had first started coming here. Carl was always friendly, though he wasn't one to speak much. Henry had always respected him for his quiet professionalism, but now Carl's face was serious as he approached. "Henry," Carl said, his tone respectful, "I just wanted to come over and apologize for what happened earlier." Henry looked up at Carl, surprised by the manager's sudden approach. "It's all right, Carl," he said softly. "I've been through worse, really." Carl didn't seem convinced by Henry's words. "It's not about being worse or better, sir. It's about respect. No one should be treated like that, especially not you. I've been here long enough to know that you deserve better than that kind of treatment." Henry was silent for a moment, letting Carl's words sink in. He hadn't expected an apology, let alone one from Carl himself. He had grown so used to just letting things go, to brushing off the small annoyances of life. But this felt different. The manager wasn't just offering a quick excuse. He was genuinely concerned about what had happened. "I'm sorry for what happened," Carl continued. "It shouldn't have gone down like that. We're a community here, and you've been part of it for so long. You deserve respect from everyone, customers and staff alike. I'll make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Henry nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't expect the apology to fix everything, but it meant something to him. It wasn't just about the words, but the sincerity behind them. For a brief moment, he felt like he wasn't invisible in this world. People still cared, and that small fact made a world of difference to him. "You're a good man, Carl," Henry said, his voice quiet but full of gratitude. "I know this place isn't always easy to run, but I've been coming here for a long time, and I've never had any complaints about the service or the people who work here. I appreciate you looking out for me." Carl's face softened at Henry's words. "Thank you, Henry. I'll make sure to talk to the staff. We take care of our regulars here, and we certainly don't tolerate any behavior that goes against that." As Carl left to return to the counter, Henry sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The apology had been small, but it was enough to make him feel like the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seemed. For a brief moment, he had been reminded that there were still good people, still good places where kindness and respect were valued. And for Henry, that was enough. It wasn't about grand gestures or fixing everything. It was the small things, the simple moments of kindness, that made all the difference. He didn't know what the rest of the day would bring, but for now, as he sat in the cafe, he felt a little more at peace. The world hadn't forgotten him. Not yet. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm. The chatter of customers filled the space, the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and the sounds of cups clinking together brought the place to life again. Henry sat at his table, still digesting the events of the morning. The apology from Carl had meant more to him than he'd expected, and the kindness from the woman who had stood up for him was something he'd hold on to for a long time. As he finished his coffee, Henry noticed something strange. A few people, who had been sitting quietly in their own corners of the cafe, now seemed to be glancing his way. It wasn't like before, when their stares had been filled with judgment. This time, their gazes were filled with something different, respect. Some of them smiled at him, others nodded, as if acknowledging something unspoken. It wasn't a loud or obvious gesture, but Henry couldn't help but notice it. He looked around, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He hadn't expected such a change. Just an hour ago, he had felt completely isolated, caught in a moment of embarrassment and shame. But now, it felt as if the room had transformed. People weren't ignoring him anymore. In fact, they seemed to be showing him a quiet, respectful appreciation that he hadn't felt in years. A woman, sitting with her friend at a nearby table, caught his eye. She smiled gently and then, almost shyly, she stood up and made her way over to Henry's table. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but Henry could sense the kindness in her actions. She was in her mid-30s with dark hair tied back neatly, and she wore a soft smile that matched the warmth in her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely as she approached his table. "I just wanted to say thank you." Henry blinked in surprise. "For what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. The woman smiled again, her expression full of sincerity. "For serving this country, for all that you've done. My grandfather was in the war too, and he always said that the world forgets about the people who made it all possible. I think the world needs more reminders of what real strength and courage look like. You're a reminder of that." Henry felt a lump form in his throat. It had been a long time since someone had spoken to him like this, like he still mattered, like his service still meant something. It wasn't a grand speech or a public gesture, but it was a quiet recognition, and it hit Henry in a way he hadn't expected. "You're very kind," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. I never expected to be remembered like that. Most people forget, or they don't understand. But it means a lot to hear it from someone who knows. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. It's important to remember, even the small things. You did something that changed the course of history. I think that deserves more than just an acknowledgement. It deserves respect. And today, I wanted to give you that. Henry smiled, his heart warming at her words. It wasn't a loud, dramatic show of support, but it was real. It was genuine. And it made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Visible, appreciated, and not forgotten. The woman gave him a nod before returning to her seat. As she left, Henry took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had earlier that morning. It wasn't about needing recognition, but it felt good to know that someone cared, that someone remembered the past and the people who had shaped the future. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to remind him that kindness, respect, and gratitude still had a place in the world. As the cafe continued with its quiet bustle, Henry felt a sense of peace settle in. He wasn't alone. And today, the world had shown him that there was still goodness in it. That, he thought, was all he could ever ask for. As the morning passed and the sun began to climb higher in the sky, Henry sat back in his chair, feeling a strange sense of calm. The world outside the cafe seemed to carry on, but inside there was a quiet shift. The tension had melted away, replaced by a feeling of warmth that Henry hadn't expected. It wasn't the kind of warmth that came from the sun or the coffee in his cup. It was the kind of warmth that came from human connection, from knowing that people still cared, even in the smallest of ways. Henry finished his coffee slowly, savoring the last few sips. He felt no rush to leave. For once, the cafe didn't feel like just a place to grab a quick meal. It felt like a place where he could belong. As he sat there, lost in thought, he noticed the young man who had been rude to him earlier walk past the window. Henry didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to look. The young man, once full of mocking comments, was now walking with his head down, his shoulders hunched. He had clearly been watching the interactions around him, and though he didn't meet anyone's eyes, Henry could see the regret in the way he carried himself. It struck Henry how quickly things could change. Only an hour ago, the young man had been full of scorn, judging him without a second thought. But now, something was different. The room was quieter, less hurried. Henry couldn't be sure, but he sensed that the young man had been touched by the events of the morning. Maybe it was the older woman's intervention, or the words spoken by others in the cafe. Whatever it was, Henry could see that the young man was carrying a different energy now, something softer, more thoughtful. Carl, the cafe manager, came over to Henry's table once again. He had been busy behind the counter, but now that things had calmed down, he seemed to have more time. "I just wanted to check in," he said, his voice more relaxed than it had been earlier. "I know the day started a little rough, but I hope you're feeling better now. I really appreciate you being patient with us." Henry looked up at Carl, nodding. "It's been a good morning, actually," he replied, smiling. "A little unexpected, but it's all been for the best." Carl smiled back, his expression genuine. "I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes it takes a little something to remind us all of what really matters." Henry chuckled softly. "It sure does," he said, his voice steady. "And today, I think I've been reminded." For the first time in a long while, Henry didn't feel like the world had left him behind. The kindness he had received, the words of gratitude and respect, had restored something inside him. He hadn't been looking for praise, but he realized that sometimes even the smallest gestures could make a world of difference. In a time when people were often too busy or distracted to notice, it was the quiet acts of understanding that had the power to change everything. As Henry stood up to leave, he felt lighter than he had in years. The cafe had become a place of unexpected healing, not just for his body, but for his spirit. He walked out of the cafe, his cane tapping gently on the pavement, and for the first time that morning, He felt the sun on his face with a quiet sense of peace. The world had a way of moving too fast. But today, Henry had been reminded that there was still room for kindness, for respect, and for the small moments that could make all the difference. And that was enough.